December 26th, 1920. 4 in the morning. A cold, gray gutter just south of the Union Square subway station, 4th Avenue and 14th Street, Manhattan. Police officers on patrol stumbled on a body sprawled face down in the street. 5 bullet holes. A .32 caliber pistol had done the work. 1 slug through the hand, 1 through the elbow, 3 through the torso, including 1 straight through the heart. The dead man wore a fine Whitty Brothers suit, gold spectacles, and carried exactly $144 in his pocket. He had managed to sprint across 14th Street before he collapsed. He died in the gutter, just a few feet from a subway entrance, on the morning after Christmas. He was 45 years old. This wasn't just another dead body on a Manhattan sidewalk. This was Monk Eastman, the most feared man in New York City at the turn of the century. A man who had commanded a private army of 1,200 street soldiers on the Lower East Side. A man who had waged open war against the 5 Points Gang in a battle so massive that 100 gangsters shot at each other for 4 straight hours across multiple city blocks. A man whose scarred face, mashed nose, and shredded ears made grown men cross the street to avoid him. And here's the part that makes this story unlike any other in the history of American crime. After prison broke him and opium nearly finished him off, Monk Eastman enlisted in the United States Army at 42 years old, shipped off to the trenches of World War I, fought with a ferocity that stunned even his commanding officers, and came home a decorated war hero. The governor of New York gave him a full pardon. His citizenship was restored. Newspapers called him a changed man. And then, barely a year later, a corrupt prohibition agent put 5 bullets in him outside a speakeasy on Christmas night. This is the story of how the last great gang boss of old New York fought 2 wars on 2 continents and lost them both. From the streets of the Lower East Side to the killing fields of France and back again, this is the rise, the fall, the redemption, and the murder of Monk Eastman. But here's what most people never knew about him. The most terrifying gangster in New York didn't just run rackets and bust heads. He ran a pet shop. He walked the streets with a blue pigeon on his shoulder and cats tucked under his arms. And if he ever caught you being cruel to an animal, he would beat you half to death. That contradiction tells you everything you need to understand about this man, and about the world that made him. You have to understand what the Lower East Side looked like in the 1880s and 90s, to understand how somebody like Monk Eastman was possible. We're talking about one of the most densely packed neighborhoods on the planet. Immigrants, stacked on top of immigrants. Jewish families from Eastern Europe, Italians from Sicily and Naples, Irish holdovers from the famine years, tenement buildings crammed with 10, 12, 15 people per apartment. The street smelled like sewage and garlic and horse manure. There was no air conditioning. There was barely any plumbing. Kids ran wild, and the gangs owned everything. Edward Eastman was born in 1875 in the Corlier's Hook section of the Lower East Side. His father, Samuel Eastman, was a Civil War veteran who worked as a wallpaper hanger. His mother was Mary Parks. By the time Monk was 5 years old, his father had abandoned the family, gone. Just walked out. Mary had no choice but to move the family in with her father, George Parks, who lived on East 75th Street on the Upper East Side. George Parks was a decent man. Worked in a dry goods store. Tried to keep the boy on the straight and narrow. He even set Monk up with a pet shop on Broome Street, hoping it would give him a legitimate way to earn a living. And for a while, it seemed to work. The records show that Monk's first documented arrest didn't come until after his grandfather died. George Parks may have been the only person on earth who could keep Monk Eastman in line. But once the old man was gone, the leash came off. Young Eastman gravitated back to the Lower East Side like iron to a magnet. He was built for the streets, 5 feet 6 inches tall, but broad as a barrel. He had a face that looked like it had been through a meat grinder. His nose was mashed flat. Where most people had ears, Monk had what one writer described as 2 shreds of flesh. Razor scars, knife scars, and bullet scars ran from his ankles up to his neck and across his face. 2 old slugs were still lodged in his belly. He wore a derby hat, 2 sizes too small, crammed down on top of a wild mop of dirty hair. His teeth were capped in gold. He looked like a man who had survived a dozen wars. And in a sense, he had. His reputation as a fighter earned him a job as the bouncer at the New Irving Hall, a notorious club on Broome Street, not far from his pet shop. They didn't call him a bouncer, though. They called him the sheriff. Monk patrolled the New Irving with a 4-foot-long police club. According to the legend, he carved a notch in it for every skull he cracked. By the time he was done working there, that stick had more notches than a prison calendar. He also became a regular at Silver Dollar Smith's Saloon on Essex Street. It was in places like these that Monk first crossed paths with the Tammany Hall politicians who would change his life. And not for the better. You have to understand how Tammany Hall worked. This was the political machine that ran New York City, and the politicians at Tammany didn't just tolerate the gangs. They used them. They needed muscle on Election Day. Guys who would intimidate voters, stuff ballot boxes, and cast votes under fake names at multiple polling stations. Monk Eastman was perfect for this. He had the men. He had the muscle. And he had absolutely no moral compass when it came to following orders. In exchange, Tammany gave Eastman something priceless: protection. As long as Monk kept the votes coming, the police left him alone. He was untouchable. And that's when Monk Eastman built his empire. By the late 1890s, the Eastman Gang was the most powerful street organization on the Lower East Side. Estimates put the membership at around 1,200 men at its peak. Safecrackers, pickpockets, hired muscle, killers. They ran brothels. They ran protection rackets. They ran gambling dens and opium parlors. Their hangouts had names that tell you everything you need to know. The Flea Bag, the Bucket of Blood, Suicide Hall. They controlled everything east of the Bowery, from the docks to 14th Street. And Monk ran it all from his pet shop on Broome Street. The same little store where his grandfather had hoped he'd sell pigeons and canaries was now the command center for one of the largest criminal organizations in the city. And about those animals, here's the thing that makes Monk Eastman so fascinating. This man, who would crack your skull open over a $5 debt, genuinely loved animals more than he loved people. He was almost never seen without a pigeon perched on his shoulder, usually a big blue one. He carried cats under his arms everywhere he went. He kept dozens of birds and cats in his shop. And he never sold any of them. He couldn't bear to part with a single one. His famous quote, in the thick Lower East Side accent that defined him, was this: "I like Dickits and Boyds." That was Monk Eastman. He would hospitalize a man for looking at him wrong. But if he caught you kicking a dog or mistreating a horse, you were going to the hospital instead. He beat animal abusers half to death without a second thought. The contradiction was real, and nobody around him could explain it. Now, west of the Bowery, there was another army, the 5 Points Gang, run by a man named Paul Kelly. His real name was Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli, but he went by Paul Kelly because it sounded more American and less threatening to the politicians he worked with. Kelly was the opposite of Eastman in almost every way. Slim, well-dressed, charming. He ran his operation out of a political club called the Paul Kelly Association, which gave the whole thing a veneer of respectability. But underneath that polish was a gang of roughly 1,500 men who dealt in robbery, racketeering, prostitution, and murder. Kelly's 5 Points Gang controlled everything west of the Bowery. Eastman controlled everything east. The Bowery itself was the border. And borders, as you know, are where wars start. The Eastman Gang and the 5 Points Gang clashed for years. Small skirmishes. Drive-by shootings from horse-drawn carriages. You read that right. Monk Eastman and Paul Kelly were among the first criminals in New York history to conduct what we would now call drive-by shootings. Except instead of cars, they used carriages. Gangsters hanging off the sides, firing pistols into crowds on the other side's territory. People were getting killed. Civilians were getting caught in the crossfire, and the violence kept escalating. Then came the night that changed everything. The night of September 15th, 1903. It was a Tuesday. Hot. Election day in New York. Both gangs had spent the day working for Tammany Hall, stuffing ballots, intimidating voters, doing what they did. After a long day of patriotic criminal service, both sides were looking to unwind. And then somebody made a mistake. It started at Livingston's saloon at First Avenue and First Street. About 40 of Eastman's men walked into the bar and immediately got into it with a group already inside. A man named Anton Bernhauer was shot through both cheeks and ran to Bellevue Hospital, spitting out his own teeth. The fighting spilled out into the street. It moved south toward Rivington Street and Allen Street, where the elevated subway tracks cast permanent shadows over the neighborhood. In 1903, Allen Street was called the Street of Perpetual Shadow, not just because of the railroad tracks overhead, but because of everything that happened underneath them. A small group of Eastman soldiers stumbled on a group of 5 pointers preparing to rob an Eastman-controlled card game underneath the elevated tracks. Guns came out. Shots were fired. And then messengers from both sides sprinted to their headquarters to call in reinforcements. Within the hour, nearly 100 gangsters had converged on Rivington Street. They took positions behind the iron columns of the elevated tracks and opened fire. The gangs turned out the street lamps. The only light came from muzzle flashes and bullets sparking off the ironwork overhead. For 4 hours they traded fire, nonstop. Bullets tore through tenement windows. Families barricaded themselves inside their apartments. You have to picture this. Dozens of armed men firing pistols and revolvers in near total darkness on residential streets packed with immigrant families. It was a war zone in the middle of Manhattan. Then Monk Eastman himself arrived. He walked into the chaos and started directing the battle like a military officer, pointing, shouting orders, moving men into position. Remember that image, because years later, on a real battlefield in France, he would do the exact same thing. But on this night, he was commanding street criminals in one of the largest gang battles in American history. It took police reserves from multiple precincts to finally put it down. When officers first arrived, the gangsters stopped shooting at each other long enough to shoot at the cops instead. Men were reported on rooftops throwing bricks down at police. It was absolute mayhem. By the time it was over, at least 2 men were dead. One of them, a 5-pointer named Michael Donovan, was shot in the stomach and lay dying in Bellevue Hospital. The police pressed him to identify his attackers. His answer was, "Pure Lower East Side. I know who shot me, and when I get out, I'll fix 'em." He died an hour later. Dozens more were wounded. One of Eastman's top lieutenants, a man named George Lolly Myers, was arrested and processed through the system without anyone realizing he had bullets lodged in both legs. They only found out 24 hours later, when the pain became too much for him to hide. The public outrage was enormous. The newspapers ran screaming headlines. Citizens demanded answers. How could 100 armed men wage a 4-hour gun battle on city streets? Where were the police? Why were these gangs allowed to exist? Tammany Hall felt the heat. The politicians who had been protecting Eastman and Kelly suddenly couldn't afford the association. They tried to broker peace. Their solution was extraordinary. They arranged a bare-knuckle boxing match between Monk Eastman and Paul Kelly in an old barn up in the Bronx. Settle it man to man. The fight reportedly lasted 2 hours and ended in a draw. Neither man could put the other down. The truce didn't hold. It was never going to. But the Rivington Street battle had changed the equation. Tammany Hall pulled its political protection from the Eastman gang. Without Tammany's shield, Monk was exposed. And he didn't last long. On February 3rd, 1904, Monk Eastman made a fatal mistake. He tried to mug a young man on 42nd Street and Broadway in Manhattan, a simple street robbery. The kind of crime his soldiers were supposed to handle, not the boss. But Monk was hands-on, always had been. What he didn't know was that the victim was being followed by 2 Pinkerton agents, hired by the young man's family to keep him out of trouble. The Pinkertons intervened. Eastman pulled a gun and started shooting while running. The chase ended when regular police officers tackled him. He was arrested. And this time, Tammany Hall didn't lift a finger. The trial was swift. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was 10 years at Sing Sing prison. Just like that, the most powerful gang boss on the Lower East Side was gone. The king was dethroned. And his kingdom fell apart. During Monk's 5 years behind bars, the Eastman gang shattered into rival factions. His top lieutenant, a man named Kid Twist Zwerbach, tried to hold things together but was murdered in 1907. Other factions went to war with each other. By the time Eastman walked out of Sing Sing in 1909, there was nothing left to come back to. No gang, no territory, no army, no respect. The men who had once followed him wouldn't even return his calls. He was 44 years old, broken, irrelevant. What followed were some of the most pathetic years in the life of a man who had once ruled the streets. Monk reverted to petty theft. He became addicted to opium. He drifted from flophouse to flophouse. In May of 1912, he was arrested for manufacturing and using opium and sent back to Sing Sing for 8 months. In November of 1915, he was arrested under a fake name for stealing silver in Albany, New York. He was sent to Dannemora prison for nearly 3 years. The man who had once commanded 1,200 soldiers was now stealing silverware and getting caught. He was released from Dannemora in October of 1917. The same month that American troops were shipping out to France, World War I was raging across Europe, and the United States had finally entered the fight. Monk Eastman was 42 years old, a convicted felon, an opium addict, a washed-up, broken-down ex-gangster with nothing left to lose. And he made the most surprising decision of his life. He enlisted. The day after his release, Monk walked up to Yonkers, New York, and signed up for the United States Army. He enlisted under the name William Delaney. They didn't ask too many questions. They needed bodies. He was assigned to the 106th Infantry Regiment of the 27th Infantry Division of the New York National Guard. The unit's nickname was Orion's Roughnecks, named after their commander, Major General Frank Orion. It was a fitting name for a unit that was about to get the most notorious street fighter in New York City history. Training happened at Camp Wadsworth in South Carolina. When Monk showed up, the younger recruits didn't know what to make of him. Here was this battered, scarred, middle-aged man surrounded by boys half his age. They teased him. They mocked the old-timer. That stopped quick. During basic training, Monk outran every single man in the unit. Younger, fitter, healthier soldiers couldn't keep up with him. The man who had spent decades fighting in Lower East Side alleys and surviving gunshots and stab wounds was in better shape than kids fresh out of high school. Then his identity came out. Someone recognized him. Word spread through the barracks. The old guy wasn't just some tough drifter. He was Monk Eastman, the Monk Eastman, the man who had commanded the biggest gang in New York, the man who had fought the Battle of Rivington Street. Suddenly the teasing turned to awe. The young soldiers were thrilled. They were going to war alongside the most dangerous brawler in the city's history. And Monk leaned into it. He started teaching his fellow soldiers what he called the Eastman School of no-holds-barred gutter fighting. Trench warfare wasn't so different from a street fight. Close quarters, chaos, no rules. Monk was built for it. They shipped out to France in 1918, and this is where the story of Monk Eastman becomes something extraordinary. Something that doesn't fit any template we have for gangsters or criminals or the men who lived by violence. On July 9th, 1918, Eastman and the 106th Infantry marched into the line at the Ypres salient in Belgium. Their mission was to stop the advancing forces of Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria. For days and nights, shells and shrapnel rained down on their position. Men were terrified. Men were dying. And Monk Eastman sat in the trench completely unperturbed. When soldiers asked him how he could be so calm, his answer became legendary among the men of the 27th Division. He reportedly said he had already fought the Battle of New York. And that was worse. At night, Monk led forays into no man's land. He crawled through mud and barbed wire to scout enemy positions and, in his words, take scalps. When German Sturmtruppen nearly overran the trenches, the seasoned Bowery Alley fighter met the Kaiser's finest with his bare fists. He fought hand to hand in the mud and the darkness. And he won. During the assault on Wehrstraat Ridge, a heavily fortified German position, Eastman charged through machine gun fire and artillery. Bullets shredded his backpack. Shrapnel sliced through his leg. He kept going. He helped put an enemy machine gun out of commission despite being wounded. He was sent to a field hospital. But when he heard his unit was about to assault the Hindenburg Line on September 27th, he escaped the hospital half-naked and barefoot. He ran back to the front lines to rejoin the fight. No one ordered him. No one asked him. He simply wasn't going to let his men go without him. While other soldiers rested, Monk volunteered for frontline duty. He carried wounded men back from no man's land. During one rescue mission, a rifle round tore through his hand. He wrapped the wound himself and kept fighting. He asked for no medical attention. He made no complaint. The man who had once hospitalized people over $5 debts was now risking his life to save total strangers in a country he had never heard of before the war. His commanding officers were stunned. The men worshipped him. His mere presence boosted morale across the entire regiment. Here was a man who had survived everything the streets of New York could throw at him, everything prison could throw at him, everything opium addiction could throw at him. And now he was surviving everything the German army could throw at him, too. Monk Eastman had found something in the trenches that the Lower East Side could never give him. Purpose. The war ended in November of 1918. On March 25th, 1919, the 27th Division marched down Fifth Avenue in New York City as heroes. Thousands of people lined the streets. Flags waved, bands played, and somewhere in the ranks of the 106th Infantry, marching in step, was Monk Eastman, the gangster, the convict, the war hero. On May 8th, 1919, Governor Alfred E. Smith of New York signed a full pardon restoring Monk Eastman's citizenship and wiping his criminal record clean. Officers and soldiers from his unit had petitioned the governor personally. They told him what Monk had done in the trenches. They said he had earned it. And the governor, himself a Tammany Hall veteran, agreed. The newspapers celebrated. They ran stories about the reformed gangster, the Lower East Side tough who had found redemption in the mud of France. The American dream in reverse. A bad man made good. But here's the thing about redemption stories. They don't always last. Within months of his pardon, Monk Eastman was back in the underworld. He went to work as an enforcer for Arnold Rothstein, the so-called brain of Broadway. Rothstein was the most powerful criminal financier in New York, the man who allegedly fixed the 1919 World Series. Monk was bootlegging for Rothstein, selling narcotics, running muscle. The trenches of France were already fading into memory. The streets of New York pulled him back. They always did. Prohibition had just begun. The 18th Amendment had turned alcohol into liquid gold. Every criminal in the city was scrambling for a piece of the bootlegging business. And Monk Eastman was working with some of the most dangerous men in the game, including a corrupt prohibition agent named Jerry Bohan. Christmas night, 1920. The Bluebird Cabaret, 62 East 14th Street, just off Union Square. Monk Eastman walked in with a group of associates, including Bohan. They sat at their usual table. They drank. They talked. And at some point during the evening, Monk started running his mouth. He told a showgirl, "Do you know who I am? I'm Monk Eastman, the gang leader who made good." He talked about quitting the criminal life, about going straight, about becoming an honest citizen. That kind of talk made the men at the table nervous, very nervous. In their world, a man who talks about going straight is a man who might talk to the police. Around 4 a.m, the argument started. Monk and Bohan went at each other over money. The details are murky. What's documented is that when Bohan got up to leave, Eastman followed him out into the cold December night. According to one account, Monk accused Bohan of being a rat. Those were fighting words. And Monk Eastman, even at 45, was still a man who spoke with his fists. But Jerry Bohan spoke with a .32 caliber pistol. As Eastman crossed 14th Street, Bohan drew his weapon and opened fire into Monk's back. An eyewitness in a nearby building described what happened next. A man was standing over him, and as they reached the window, they saw him fire 4 more shots into the man on the sidewalk. The murderer bent over his victim a moment, presumably to make sure he was dead. Bohan then jumped into a waiting taxicab and disappeared into the night. Monk Eastman lay in the gutter near the Union Square subway station, 5 bullets in his body. He was wearing a fine suit, gold spectacles. $144 in his pocket. The man who had survived 100 street fights, a decade of prison, and the Western Front of World War I was killed outside a speakeasy on the morning after Christmas by a corrupt federal agent with a grudge. On January 4th, 1921, Jerry Bohan walked into the Lee Avenue police station in Brooklyn and turned himself in. He claimed self-defense. He said Eastman had threatened him. A Manhattan jury didn't entirely buy it, but they didn't throw the book at him either. Bohan was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 3 to 10 years. He served roughly 3 years. 3 years for killing a war hero. But the funeral was something else entirely. Monk Eastman was buried with full military honors at Cypress Hills Cemetery in Brooklyn. Hundreds of soldiers who had fought alongside him in the trenches filed past his casket. An honor guard escorted his coffin through the streets of New York. The man who had been a convicted felon, a street thug, and an opium addict was laid to rest with the same honors given to generals and Medal of Honor recipients. Because whatever else Monk Eastman had been, he had been a soldier, a real one. The story of Monk Eastman is the story of old New York disappearing. He was the last of the great gang bosses who ruled through personal ferocity and brute strength. After him, the game changed. Paul Kelly's 5 Points gang didn't just fade away. It produced the next generation of organized crime. Johnny Torrio, who learned his trade under Kelly, moved to Chicago and built a criminal empire. He brought along a young protege named Al Capone. Lucky Luciano came out of the 5 Point streets, too. So did dozens of others who would create the American Mafia as we know it. The Sullivan Act of 1911, passed partly in response to the Rivington Street battle, made carrying an unregistered firearm a felony in New York. Before that, having a pistol carried a $10 fine. The man who pushed the law through, Big Tim Sullivan, was himself a corrupt Tammany boss who had been closely associated with both Eastman and Kelly. Monk Eastman belonged to a different era, an era when a gang boss walked the streets with a pigeon on his shoulder and a police club in his hand, when wars were fought face-to-face on cobblestone streets, not through intermediaries and lawyers and accountants, when a man's power was measured by the scars on his body and the fear in other men's eyes. That world was already dying when Monk went to prison in 1904. By the time he came back from France in 1919, it was gone completely. He spent 45 years fighting on the streets of the Lower East Side, in the yard at Sing Sing, in the trenches of the Western Front, on the sidewalks outside speakeasies. He fought with fists, clubs, pistols, and bayonets. He fought for territory, for survival, for his country, and finally, for nothing at all. 5 bullets in a gutter on a cold December morning. That's how it ended for the man they called Monk. There's a grave in Cypress Hills Cemetery in Brooklyn. It has a small military marker. Most people walk right past it without a second glance. But if you stop and read the name, you'll find one of the strangest and most contradictory stories in the history of New York City. A gangster who loved pigeons, a killer who saved wounded soldiers, a convict who earned a governor's pardon, a war hero who died in the gutter. Monk Eastman lived every one of those contradictions, all the way to the end. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe. We drop a new documentary every week. Drop a comment below. What figure from old New York should we cover next?